Hi guys, welcome to another video. This one's a big one, so a quick tip, you can always watch the video 1.5 times speed for quicker learning. Alright, let's get to it. So in this video today, we're going to go through syntax fundamentals. So we're really going to decode the AMPscript language, break it down into like several components for you to understand. We're going to cover a few things in this video. The first one being an AMPscript code editor. So you might not know, but in Salesforce Marketing Cloud, when you code or write anything in AMPscript, it is just like in plain text, like a notepad. There's nothing highlighted. You can't see the variables, the conditional statements, or the functions. So it's a little bit difficult to code, especially for a beginner. So I'll introduce to you some like code editors that are free online, which helps you with your code and even highlights certain errors. So I think that's very useful. Next thing, we're going to cover the personalization strings. This is probably the entry level into learning AMPscript, really playing with the data that you have in your data extension. We'll go through inline AMPscript, AMPscript blocks. So these are all different variations of AMPscript that you can code in your email templates or SMS messages. It will make more sense when I go through them. The concept of variables. So this is something that's probably very difficult for someone who hasn't done any programming language before. I'll introduce and explain what a variable is, what you can do with it, and how can you use it as an advantage in AMPscript. We'll finish it off with retrieving data from the sending data extension, just understanding the different ways that you can retrieve data, like the fields that you want to use in your email or SMS messages. And then finally, the AMPscript best practice. So moving forward, I think it's good when you start coding now, learning the best practice so you can keep it as a habit. So then, when you write code in the future, it's all organized, it's all well documented, and everyone can read your code. Anyway, let's get started. Again, quick tip, you can always watch the video in 1.5 times speed, and when you finish with the video, you can click the mark as done on the top right corner to track your progress. Cool. So the first thing here is the editors, right? So there's a few editors that you can download. The first one being Visual Studio. So this is a program, I have the link down there in the description. You can download this, and this is just on your platform where you can actually, on your PC, sorry, that you can actually download and write AMPscript code. I tend to use Visual Studio Code for all my projects at my work. It's very easy. You go to the extension in here and you just type in AMPscript. There's a few different editors here. Just download one of them, install one of them, and then you can see how your code is highlighted. It's very useful here. AMPscript.io is something that I've been using with my students, with my coaching. It's a free online website where you can just literally type AMPscript code. It highlights your errors on the right here. This one's very useful as well. So for any code in terms of AMPscript, when you're writing it, you can just code it right in here, copy and paste it in my assignment pages if you want to work on the assignments and do the challenges. But in terms of your actual work, if you actually have access to a Salesforce Marketing Cloud environment, code it in here. It's very useful. You can see the syntax highlighted, see any errors, and if it's all good, paste it in and then preview and test it in your environment. So these are the two code editors that I recommend for sure. Okay, so decoding the syntax. All right, so there's three main components when you really want to understand the syntax of AMPscript. The first one being personalization strings. Personalization strings is really just the direct output of whatever data there is in your sending data extension. So here are some examples. I'll go down into deeper explanation on each of these components, but this is just a high level. So the first one, personalization strings. Again, hi, first name, welcome to the family. The syntax is very simple. You just have 2% signs on either side of the field name. And this literally just prints out whatever the data is in the data extension. So you probably can guess it's probably not as best practice because you don't know how clean the data is, right? But this is your personalization strings. The second component is inline AMPscript. So inline AMPscript is when you apply a function to a field directly in the message, right? In the SMS message or in the HTML of your email. So in this case, again, we're playing around with whatever data there is from the data extension, first name, we're applying a proper case function. A proper case function, I'll dive deeper later on, but it basically just corrects the casing of the word in the first name value. So it will capitalize the first letter and lowercase all remaining characters in that field. So it'll be like a capital V for Vincent, because sometimes the data stored in data extensions is not always correct, right? Finally, you have your AMPscript block. So this is where you actually code and get very practical with AMPscript. AMPscript block is mainly used for more complex kind of conditional statements and data transformations. The idea of an AMPscript block is all the logic is stored within one code snippet, and you usually host it at the top of an email template or at the top of an SMS message, and then you just output the variables in the actual message as so. This will make sense. I'll go down in deeper in each detail, but these are the three main components that we'll dive deep into in the next slides. Okay, so let's start with, I should say, personalization strings. So there's two types of personalization strings, really. There's an attribute string and there's a system string. So the attribute string, as I mentioned before, is the direct output from the data extension. Really, there's no transformations, there's no conditional statements. You're literally just printing out whatever value there is, whatever field you're calling in the data extension. The reason why I want to emphasize this is because it's probably not best practice. Hi, first name in this first example here, welcome to the family. This first name, you're really heavily relying on that the data is correct in your data extension. It's all in proper case, there's no spaces, so that you can print it out nice and neat in the email or SMS message. I tend to not do this, especially with first name, where the data can be incorrect and inconsistent. But in terms of other data like your member number or your subscriber key, where you're certain for sure that each record has that value populated correctly, then why not use personalization strings? It's very easy. The syntax, as you can see, is literally just 2 percentage signs on either side of the field name. What's important is the field name must match exactly as the field name in your sending data extension that you're using for the send. So that's just a pointer there. But again, I don't tend to use this for first name, but for stuff like member number, maybe your venue property ID or venue property name, something that you know that each record has, then it's fine to use. So in terms of system strings, so not many people actually know there's actually backend strings or personalization strings you can use and leverage for your email and SMS messages. So these are Marketing Cloud system strings. So they're not available in your sending data extension, but you can actually call and retrieve in the email. So I have a link here to documentation. There's a bunch of different system strings that you can use. An example one here is recalling the month of the current date. So here is your month newsletter. So it could be, here's your April newsletter, here's your June newsletter. So that can be dynamic and it just recalls the actual month of the current time. The view email URL is another common one. You'll see at the top of the header of the email where you can actually view the email as a web page online. This is a system personalization string where you can actually insert into the link. So this is something also very useful. Again, as a note, I want to emphasize as much as I can, please ensure before using attribute strings that the data is of good quality, because there are so many scenarios where I work with different clients where they just use a personalization string for the first name and they realize when they send the email out, they have random spaces. Some customers actually don't have a first name. Some are all in all caps for some reason, and it's not not a good experience for the customer. Cool. So again, personalization strings, this is just another, I guess, practice exercise. Here's an example of a subject line and a pre-header, first name, tier, property name. If you were to use personalization strings, assuming that all the data is correct, this is your sending data extension. I guess what I want to highlight here is how easy it is in terms of the syntax. All you need to do is copy and paste the actual first name field in the sending data extension, populate it here with 2 percentage signs on each side in order for it to print out in the actual email or SMS message. So it's that simple. Okay, so we're in the Salesforce Marketing Cloud tool now in my test environment. Okay, here is the sample data extension, right? This is your customer D. These are all the fields that I have available that I can use in the email or SMS send, right? So you have your member number, first name, last name, and so on. So say, for example, I want to literally print out the first name in my email, which I have here. A good tip as well, always have multiple tabs open. You don't want to go back and forth, go log in and navigate to Content Builder, navigate back to Email Studio, navigate and so forth. It's really time consuming. Have multiple tabs open, that's a good tip. So this is my sample email here. This is my subject line. Let me zoom in. Say that I want to say, hi first name, welcome to the community, right? So to do that, literally just copy and paste the first name field. And I recommend copy and pasting the actual field in the data extension rather than typing it out, because most of the time people make mistakes and they realize why their code is erroring. So let's do this. Hi, %, paste in the field name, %, comma, welcome to the community. And maybe I have, that should be fine, and save. So really that's all you need to do. You can preview and test it now. Like so. To preview and test, click the folder icon, find your data extension, click a record, let me zoom back out, select, and then there you go. You can see the first name populating here. But straight off the bat, as you can see firsthand, doing a personalization string with the first name is not best practice, because if the data in the data extension is not of good quality, you will have that printed out exactly in the email. So in this case, James is in a lowercase j, right? And if I move on, Peter's in a lowercase as well. And then for this record that has no first name, this is what it will look like. So obviously it's a bad customer experience, but I guess I want to highlight to you that using personalization strings can be easy, but not always good. Just depends on the data, right? If the data was something like member number, welcome to the community, this is your member number. I know this is not a good subject line. I just want to highlight to you how to use personalization strings. Just copy and paste the member number field there, %, done, save, preview, and there we go. So member number 102, 103. So something like that, where you know that each record has it, because maybe it's a subscriber key, then fine, you can print it out. Maybe normally they have some sort of member number here, or loyalty tier, or whatever it is. You just print it out. That's totally fine. Another thing to point out as well, if your field name does have a space in it, obviously my data extension doesn't, but in most scenarios, you always come across a data extension that will have a space in the field name. There's nothing wrong with that in terms of using it as a personalization string. Say for example, if my member number has a number in it, has a space in it, then you just have a space in it in there. That's it. As long as you have 2 percentage signs on either side, it will recognize that this is a field name that you're trying to call from the sending data extension, and it will print out accordingly. Cool. That's pretty much it. All right, let's get back into the PowerPoint. Okay, so the next one here is, so these are probably the most common system strings. So I didn't show you how the system strings work in the tool, but we can do that in a bit. So here, you can use month, you can use short date, long date, message context, email, subscribe key, and view email URL. Really, honestly, from my experience, I have rarely used the system strings. The most common one are probably these dates here. Message context is really good because you can actually identify when the email is in a sender mode or preview mode or view online mode, and you can do a bunch of different things. This is probably more complex though, so I'll actually teach you probably in the advanced course. So we'll leave that for now. But yeah, extracting the current month is probably very useful. The short date if you really want to, and then you can reformat to whatever date you want, date format you want to see in the email, and so forth. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight you the common ones that you can use. So yeah, why not? Actually, let's try out the current month. So XT month, let's do that now before we move on. So say for example, I want XT month. The best method is just literally copy and paste. Where am I? Let's copy and paste that in here. So welcome to the community. This is your newsletter. There we go. This is probably a good use case, getting the current month to specify the monthly newsletter is very useful. You can automate this process. You don't have to manually create. Imagine creating like 12 newsletters every year, right? For each month. All right, let's preview this. And there we go, April newsletter, right? So that's just an example there. Cool, okay, moving on. The next section here is Inline AMPscript. So inline AMPscript is actually not so different from personalization string. It's very similar in the way that the output is really displayed in the code's location of the message. So whatever you print out, maybe in the subject line or in the body of the email, it actually prints out the result there. The only difference here is that you're using a single function to sort of clean up the data. So previously, in this example here, we had hi %%, first name %%, and that directly record the data from the data extension. Now with inline AMPscript, you can actually apply a function directly to the field name before it's printed out. So now here we applied a proper case function. So again, the proper case function literally just capitalizes the first letter of the text and lowercases all remaining characters in that string, in that first name field. So then in our example, it will be hi James with a capital J and lowercase AMES. So yeah, again, it's only used for a single function. Personally, I don't really tend to use this too much. I prefer the AMPscript block method, which I'll show you in a bit. But in terms of the syntax, it's fairly simple. You have your %%. Now you're adding two equal sign as well at the end. And then you have your function. So in this case, it's proper case, but there is other functions like uppercase, lowercase, trim. There's a bunch of different functions that I'll take you through in the next video. But then you have your bracket and you have your field name in there. And that's basically it. So you'll use this for single functions. You will use this for conditional statements, which I'll show you in the next week's video as well. Again, though, this is probably not enough. Using a single function here, in this case, is not enough, right? Imagine if your first name value also has random spaces that you need to trim. So then if you're applying a single function like this, it's not cleaning that aspect of the data. And what if your first name field doesn't have a first name value as well? So doing a proper case here again, using a single function, doesn't fix that use case. So again, be mindful of the data, make sure it's of good quality to use something like this. Otherwise, refer to like an AMPscript block instead. So again, maybe I can show you an example of how this inline AMPscript will work. So let's go into the tool. Okay, so we're back in the tool here. This is my subject line. Let's get rid of this. Welcome to the community. Let's do our same example here by first name, and now we're going to use inline AMPscript %% equals proper case bracket equals %%. And what are we going to put in there? We're going to put in there our first name field, copy and paste it. So, and done. Save. So let's preview this now. Again, see, for this record that doesn't have a first name field, it will still look the same. So it's not best practice in this sense, right? But for example, if we look at another record, Peter, there we go. It's in proper case, and in James, it's in proper case. So yeah, that's just an example highlighting that, if the record doesn't have a first name value, inline AMPscript is probably also not your best option. You can slowly see moving on to the different methods. But yeah, it does proper case your first name value there, if it has a value in it. Cool. All right, moving on. Okay, AMPscript block. So this is the final method in which you can write AMPscript code in your email or SMS messages. AMPscript blocks is probably the most preferred method, especially for me. It's because it's a lot cleaner. You have all your logic hosted and stored within one code snippet block at the top of the email, which you can easily edit, and then you're just outputting the variables that you want to display in your email SMS message. So as opposed to your personalization strings and inline AMPscript, like I mentioned before, all your logic and code is stored within a code snippet block, and it's wrapped around these two symbols here. You have your %% square brackets, your actual AMPscript code, and then square brackets %%. So as you can see in this example here, everything is stored in this code snippet block, and I'll show you what that looks like in terms of a content block and an email template. And then you're just outputting the variable that you've transformed or cleaned up in the email itself. And the output of this variable is a different syntax as well. You use %% equals V for variable, and in the brackets, the variable that you want to print out. So I'll dive deeper in the next slides here, but this is an example of what a code snippet looks like within an AMPscript block. So this is the AMPscript block decoded. So what you saw before, you might have noticed that the first section here, it's slightly grayed out. The reason why it's grayed out is because it is optional. You don't have to do this, and I personally don't do it. It is in the documentation though, so I want to explain to you what's happening here. So what you see here is what we call we're declaring the variables that we're going to use in the code snippet block. And as you declare the variables, you're actually setting them as null, ensuring that they have no value, so then you can, essentially assign a value in your following code. I guess the main reason why people do this is because it makes it easier to read. If you declare all your variables at the top, you're telling the reader when you hand over to another colleague or to yourself when you're reading it in the future that these are the variables that we're going to use in this code. So you can kind of identify what is happening and look for where that variable is being assigned a value. Again, I don't use this. It's up to you. I'm able to see where my variables are, so really up to you. In my experience and in my experience working with other people in my company and with clients, no one uses this really. Anyways, moving on. The next section here, as you can see in green, is set at first name. So this is what we call when we create a variable and we're assigning it a value. So when you set a variable something, you're giving it a value. And in this case, what we're giving the value is our first name field from the sending data extension. So you notice that the first name is wrapped around with square brackets. So wrapping around square brackets tells Marketing Cloud, okay, this is a field that you're referencing in the sending data extension that I need to retrieve. And in this case, this is the first name field. What you see in highlight in blue, this is an example of a function that's being applied. And then what you see in yellow is everything is wrapped in this code snippet block, right? In this AMPscript block. Again, the syntax is %% square brackets, %%. So this is an example of an AMPscript block. It's nice and neat. You're retrieving the first name field from the sending data extension, assigning it a value to this variable, and then you're creating a new variable, which is the result of a function that you will proper case, and that result of that new variable is what you're going to print out in the actual HTML or in your SMS message. Again, to output a variable, it's within this syntax, %% equals V for variable, and in the brackets, the variable that you want to print out. Again, I'll dive deeper into what a variable is and how you can create variables and this type of like data points that you can store in a variable. But this is just a preview in terms of what an AMPscript block look like. Here's another example. I probably won't go in too much detail because I'll cover this in next week's video. But I just want to show you what a typical AMPscript block looks like. So if you're currently working in a company where you have someone that's coding AMPscript already and you want to learn it and you don't want it to confuse you, typically AMPscript blocks will have conditional statements, and conditional statements is what you see here: your if, your else, your and if. And this is really the foundations of dynamic content, right? If a certain variable equals something, then you want to create something, right? Else create something else. So here's just an example, and if we decode it, the only difference here is what you see in purple, the conditional statements. It evaluates the values of variables based on a condition to set a specific outcome, right? So in this case, just to give you a quick preview, if not empty at first name. So if my first name field is not empty, then I want to proper case it, right? Then I want to set a new variable, salutation equals proper case first name. So, in our example in Marketing Cloud earlier, if it was James, if it was Peter, if it's not empty, I want to clean it up, apply the proper case function. Else, meaning that it is empty, so it's the opposite to what our condition was at the beginning, then I want to manually set the salutation variable as customer, right? So as you can see, the salutation variable can equal two different values depending on the condition on whether the first name field is empty or not. And then you close the conditional statement with end if, and then now when we print out our salutation variable, it can either equal the proper case of the first name if the first name is not empty, but if it is empty, it will say, hi customer, welcome to the family. Or hi there. You can imagine if I replace this with there, hi there, welcome to the family. It's really up to the marketer, it's up to you, but this is just an example of how you can use conditional statements within an AMPscript block, so then you can provide a default value if, in this scenario, the first name is empty. So yeah, again, in next week's video, I'll actually dive deep into conditional statements, give you a bunch of different examples and teach you how to use it to your advantage. But here, I just want to give you a preview because most of the time when you see an AMPscript block, it would be using conditional statements. Cool, let's move on. Here's just another slide to give you the information that I just explained. It's just another view because I know people learn in different ways. So if you like a list view, a table view, this is just a quick description of what all the components are in that diagram before. Let's move on. So now you know the three different types of methods, right? You have your personalization strings, your inline AMPscript, and your AMPscript block. So how does that actually look like in an email? Okay, so let's go through it. So as you saw with personalization strings and inline AMPscript, it's directly in the actual message, right? Whether it's in the HTML, in the subject line, in your SMS message. You can see here, maybe I'll zoom in. Let's zoom in here. So this first method here, you're applying the proper propagate function directly in the message here, right? Similar to your personalization string, whatever you're doing, whatever logic, you're just printing out whatever data is in the data extension in your copy, right? So that's your personalization string and your inline AMPscript. With your AMPscript block, this is what I was explaining earlier. There's an AMPscript code snippet block or content block in the Email Studio that you can drag in at the top of the email. And at the top of the email, you host all your logic, all your code to make your components dynamic. And then you're just printing out the variables in the actual copy. So this I'll show you later on. I know at the moment, if you look at this, it's probably confusing you and scaring you because it's a bunch of code. But really, I will, in next week's video, in week 2, you'll be able to code something like this yourself. So don't worry. But yeah, I just wanted to show you what it looks like in Email Studio or Content Builder when you're building an email template out. The final method here is also another version of an AMPscript block. You can actually host your AMPscript block in individual content blocks as well. So as opposed to having everything in the code snippet at the top, you can also have it within individual content blocks like so, within the HTML, and then you're printing out the variable as so. Again, it's really up to you. My preferred method for sure is the code snippet block at the top. I guess you would use this for individual content blocks if you are reusing that content block across multiple emails, right? Which makes sense. So then you don't have to code it again. It's all hosted within that content block and you can just drag and drop it into your email template. You can do that the same with code snippets as well. You can save this code snippet as its standalone content block that you can reuse from your library. But I guess for more custom, transformations or conditional statements or dynamic content for that specific email, it is easier to have it just as a separate code snippet at the top here. Cool. So now looking at it in another view, just to help you if you're learning, code snippet block at the top, this is where you store all your logic. Personalization string or inline AMPscript directly in the copy, and your AMPscript inside content blocks alone is here as well. So there's all the different examples when you decode the syntax. When you look at an email template that already has AMPscript in it, now you can identify and recognize, okay, this guy is building it like this. Okay, we have some inline AMPscript here. We have a code snippet block here. So hopefully this helps you identify and recognize the different types of AMPscript methods in your use case. Cool. I guess why not? I'll move on to the tool as well. So on the left here, you see your basic content blocks. Literally the code snippet block you drag to the top, click in it, and this is where you can, code your AMPscript. Like so. And then all you need to do is write in your code, right? Blah, 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 whatever you want it, right? So you host it in there at the top. You can actually use multiple code snippet blocks. So not multiple, like different content blocks in here. So you can use a code snippet, you can use a free form, or you can use a HTML. As long as you have your AMPscript code wrapped around like this, then it tells Marketing Cloud that it is an AMPscript piece of script or code, and then it won't actually print out whatever you're typing here in an email. It will recognize it, it will render, and it will create your variables for you that you want to print out. So that's just a tip here. I like to use just a code snippet block, it's up to you. But yeah, you can use code snippet, freeform, or HTML. Cool, let's move on. Okay, so the next one here is variables, right? So now let's dive deep into variables, what it is, explain to you how you can create it and what you can store inside of it. So variables is it could be a hard concept to understand, especially if you're non-technical, and especially if it's your first kind of programming language. The best way that I explain to my students is that think of a variable as a named container or a container that you can label, right? Think of it as a food container. You can store any types of food in it. You can chop it up if you really need to, if it's too big, and store it inside your food container and put a label on it, right? So that's probably my best way of explaining what a variable is because it's essentially that, right? You can call your variable anything you want, and you can store any value you want inside of it. The only, I guess, syntax rules that you need to keep mindful of is that, yes, a variable needs to have an @ symbol beforehand, and it can't have spaces, dashes, or slashes. And there's 4 different types of values that you can also store inside a variable. So I have this slide here for reference, so you can pause and look at it, but I'm also going to code it in real time just to help explain in further detail. So let's go into actually ampscript.io and let's code this together. So let's go to ampscript.io. Yep, let's go in here. Okay, so let me zoom in here. Cool. So always start off with your opening and ending tags, right? There we go. So in terms of variables, again, to create a variable, you always need to set it. The starting of a variable is always an @ symbol, right? @ symbol, and then you can call it whatever you want. First name equals. So this is just an example of me creating a first name variable and giving it a value, a static value called Vincent, right? In terms of that actual variable, you can actually create it in multiple ways. It's really up to you, right? I can name it first name like so. I can name it first underscore name. I can name it F name. There's no limitations, right? You don't have to have it exactly called the same field name in your Dart extension. You can shortcut it, you know? First name equals Vincent if you really want to. The only rule with variables is that you can't have random spaces in it. So if you do something like this, obviously it won't recognize this as one word and won't recognize this as a variable, and it will error out your code, right? So you can't have random spaces, you can't have dashes, you can't have forward slashes, you can't have random brackets in here like so. This won't recognize that it's a variable, right? So you can name it whatever you want to name it, as long as it's one word, and you can actually use underscores as well. The best practice, I guess, when creating a variable is to use what we call camel case format. So you have the first word in lowercase, and any following words you start with a capitalize, right? So first name. I guess the reason for doing this is just it's easy on the eyes. You can read it and understand it. So imagine you have something like this, first name trim. So say, for example, you created a variable where you want to trim the first name field, and this is the result of the function. If you were to hand over this to someone straight off the bat, they have to kind of stop and think, okay, what is this variable? What is it trying to do? As opposed to something like this, where you have first named trimmed. Then you can sort of easily recognize it, right? You can see, okay, this is 3 different words, first name trimmed. Okay, obviously this variable will be the result of the trimmed first name value, for example. So yeah, those are just some quick tips when creating variables. Now, what kind of values can we store in a variable? So there's 4 different things that you can store in a variable, right? You can store it as a static value that I showed you earlier. This is simply a static value. So then when I print this out in an email, and again, the syntax to print a variable out in an email is %%. So this is the way I like to teach my students for them to easily remember, right? So you're really familiar with personalization strings, right? It's very simple. You have the 2% sign on either side, and you have your field name right in the middle. The difference is with variables is now you have your %% on either side. You have your variable in the middle, including with the @ sign. Now on either side, you added equal V for variable, and then wrap your variable in brackets, and then add a final equal sign at the end of it. And that's your syntax to print out variables, right? % equals V, brackets, first name variable, whatever variable you want to print out, close the brackets, equals %%. And now in this case, every time I use this variable in my email, it only can equal Vincent. So it's not dynamic, right? Because I'm giving it a static value, a fixed value. It only can equal Vincent. It can equal Bob. That means when I print it out here in the subject line, it can only equal Bob, right? So that's something I want to emphasize. Another value that I can assign to a variable is retrieving it from the sending data extension. So using square brackets like this tells Marketing Cloud that whatever is inside these square brackets, it's a field name that you're referencing from your data extension that you're going to use for the send. And in this case, it's going to be my first name field. Okay, let me refresh this. So if I'm in my data extension here and I literally have the first name field, again, copy and paste right into here, then I'm retrieving the first name field, and whatever value is in the first name field for that record, it's going to be assigned to this first name variable. So now in this case, when I print out this variable is dynamic, right? Depending on the value for that record in that first name field, it could be James, it could be Peter, then this will print out in the actual email. Okay, so that's another value. So I can, call first name, I can retrieve maybe the property name, and say if I go into my data extension, the property name, I can choose signed up property as so, store it in here, and now this variable that I just created called property name, again, you can call it anything you want. Maybe I can call it venue name, right? Lowercase v if you want to. If I call it venue name, and now when I print out venue name in here, then it's going to print out the signed up property for that record. And that signed up property can be different. It could be the Sydney Plaza, it could be the Adelaide Plaza, the Brisbane Plaza, whatever it is for that record in the data extension. So this is another way you can assign a value to a variable. Let's get rid of this. Cool. The third method is you can actually retrieve values or data from another data extension. I'll actually go into detail later on in the next few weeks because this is a little bit more technical. I just want to show you now so you're familiar with what's possible with AMPscript. But you can actually assign a value to a variable that is from data that is stored in another data extension. So if I do a lookup function here, bracket, this is the data extension that I want to look up. I want to retrieve the first name field where the member number is 1002. This is just an example. So in this case, I'm looking up a customer data extension. I want to retrieve the first name field where the member number is 1002. So then I'm giving a value to this first name variable. So that's just another method, okay? The final method is you can actually assign a value to a variable as a result of a function. So if I apply this trim function here to my first name variable, like so, the result of this function, so the trimming of the first name, trim is another function where it removes the spacing before and after a value stored in a data extension. And the use case for this is if you have some sort of sign up form, most of the time customers will have random spaces for some reason in the form, in the first name, and this just cleans it up, right? It removes the spacing before and after. But the result of this function, once it's performed, can be assigned the value to this variable. So those are your four different types of values or that you can store in your data extension. Cool. All right, cool. Let's go back here. This is just everything on one slide that I just took you through. Again, 4 different ways you can assign a value. You can hard code it, give it a static value. You can retrieve it from the setting data extension. You can look up another data extension to extract a value or field name, or it's the result of a function, the output of a function or data transformation, as so. And you can print all your emails, all your variables right here. Cool. Moving on. So this is an example that you saw earlier. I just want to highlight the variables that are in play, right? So you have your @firstName variable here, which they're giving the value of a data extension here, first name field from the data extension. And then here you're creating a new variable called salutation, which is the result of a function after they propagate first name, right? Or in here, they're giving the salutation a static value. So again, this is using with conditional statements. So in this case, if the first name field is not empty, then I want to set salutation, which is my variable that I want to output in the actual subject line, equaling the proper case of the first name field. Else, if it is empty, then I just want to hard code the value for salutation as customer. Then when I print out the salutation variable, it's hi James, welcome to the family, or hi customer, if there's no first name value, welcome to the family. Cool. So in terms of the data types for variables, there's a bunch of things that you can store in here. This is probably the 5 main or primary data types that you will be playing with. First one being string. So again, this is a static fixed value. So here you can have customer, you can have hello, and you have don't miss out. So not only can you just store a single word, you can store a whole sentence in there if you really want to. And it's actually useful when you soon create dynamic content, dynamic subject lines. You can imagine you can create a whole subject line as a dynamic variable that you can print out, right? In terms of strings, you can use single quotes or you can use double quotes. The only scenario where you have to use double quotes is if in your value or in your string, you have apostrophes, like, the apostrophe here in don't. If you have that, then you need to have double quotes on either side instead of single quotes. Otherwise, Marketing Cloud will get confused. Whole numbers, you can have it as the number itself without quotes, or you can have single quotes or double quotes. Same thing. Decimals, same thing. You can have it without quotes, single or double. With dates, so dates is a big one. I'll have it as a separate video where you kind of play around with dates. You can transform it, add days, add months, subtract days, subtract months, whatever you want to do. I'll have that as a separate video in this week. But here are all the different types of dates that you can store in a variable. So you can store it like this, 15th-October-2024. And as you can see, it's all in quotes or double quotes as well. So these are all the different formats. I won't go through detail, but you can just see it here. You can also include the time, right? So this is probably useful if you want to set some expiry kind of values in your email or SMS, or you want to calculate the remaining days to a specific date. So this is very useful. In terms of Boolean fields, so Boolean is your true or false. So that's one of the data types that you can set in your data extension. If you want to set it as a value for a variable, you can use single quotes, true, false, or even in all uppercase as well, in all caps, true or false. I think the most useful one is 1 or 0. So this is something that I personally use. 1 is actually the equivalent to true, and 0 is the equivalent to false. It's just a lot easier when you're writing code. And most of the time when you write it from scratch, you can make mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes where I spelled false wrong. It's not like I don't know how to spell it. It's just when you're typing away, when you're in the zone, you just don't realize. And when you want to preview something, you're like, what the heck? Why is it erroring out? And you realize you spelled false wrong. So 1 and 0 is a lot easier. Cool. All right, so retrieving data from the setting data extension. So there's actually 3 different ways that you can retrieve data from a data extension. The first way that you kind of already been exposed to is using the square brackets here, right? So the square brackets here is the most preferred way, but there are pros and cons to each. So let's go into AMPscript.io and let me code it with you. Okay, so we're in AMPscript.io now, and let's code this out. So the first method here, you're already familiar with. first name, square brackets, first name, like so, right? Using square brackets, whatever is in here tells Marketing Cloud, okay, this is going to be a field name in my sending data extension. What you can also do is simply just have the first name field populated here. This also works as well. If this first name field is exactly the field name in your data extension, then you can just simply print it out like so, and this works fine. The only reason why you will introduce the square brackets is if in your field you have a space like this. So in your data extension, imagine that you have some sort of space in the field name, then coding it in this way will actually error out your code because this space is not recognized. That's why I prefer using square brackets, because in the scenario, whether it has a space or it doesn't have a space, this square bracket method will still work. So if your first name field has a space, then writing it within square brackets, that's totally fine. While this one, it will error out. But say, for example, all your fields don't have any spaces, then fine, you can code it like this if you want to. The other method is you can actually do something like this, what we call attribute value. And inside here, you have your first name field. So writing code in this way is just the same as writing code here. The only difference is if the field name in the square brackets is incorrect, as in it doesn't match your sending data extension, your code will error out, which in a way you probably want it to happen, right? So it kind of notifies you, okay, you've made a mistake here. It doesn't recognize the field name in the data extension. You know, you get that red notification in the preview, go fix your code, right? So this is why I use this. It's probably the best practice. With attribute value, if the field name is incorrect, it actually won't error out your code. It will just set this field name as null, this variable as null, if it doesn't recognize the field name in the data extension. So I guess that's the only difference. You'll see people use attribute value if they want to create some content blocks that are reusable across multiple email templates, and sometimes certain fields are not required, right? So if it's not required, then it will just set it as null anyways. You're not using it, but you can use that content block across multiple emails. If you were to use the square brackets in this sense, then if one field name is incorrect, your whole email will error out. So I guess that's the difference. But yeah, that's basically it. There's 3 ways of writing code to retrieve data from your sending data extension. Again, the most preferred method is this one for sure, because it actually notifies you if you have a mistake, and it also caters to field names with spaces. Another thing that I want to point out is the reason why we use variables in the first place. So the reason why we want to assign a variable the value of the field name from the data extension, as opposed to just using the field name directly in a function, is because that we can use and reuse the variable throughout the code again and again. So if I do something like this, it will make more sense in the next video when we dive deeper into using functions and playing with functions and variables. But say, for example, you guys already know this function here, the proper case function, right? So say I create a new variable called first name proper case equals proper case, and instead of having a variable in here, you can actually directly call the field name from the sending data extension. This also works as well. But say in the future, maybe you have another function. It will make more sense later on, but say I have another function called uppercase, right? Instead, I want to uppercase the first name field, like so, right? You can directly call the field name again, and this works fine. But say, in the future, I decide to use another data extension, and now the first name field is no longer called first name. It's now called first name underscore. So let me get rid of these two. And say we're using this to recall the first name field from the data extension, but now this field name is changed. So then if I use this method, I would have to change my code throughout every time I had that first name field reference, right? Which takes time. Imagine if you write like a whole page of code and you have to change all the field names because you're using a different data extension. Now, if you had a variable instead, then all you need to do, so if I put the variable here instead, and say that this field name changes, all I need to do is just change the field name in here and everything will reflect accordingly, right? It's a lot easier to code and change and update whatever you want to do with it if everything is stored as a variable. So you could store first name underscore here or first space name. I can change this to whatever field name there is in the data extension and this will reflect accordingly. So this is just another tip. It's very useful. It's something that I do. I like to assign everything as a variable because then in the future, again, you can just edit it at the top of the email. And you guys should use this as well moving forward. Cool. So I have everything on the slide here with the pros and cons, but I just want to give you the options and as well as for you to recognize when you look at a bit of code that you can see, okay, what's happening in this scenario. Cool, let's move on. Okay, cool. So AMPscript best practice. So we're almost at the end of the video. This is the last section here. I just want to take you through, because you're starting to learn how to write AMPscript code, it's probably good for you to get in the habit to do these things. So then, you don't have to force change the way you code certain things because you already implemented from the beginning, right? So it's good practice, good foundations. So the first bit here is your AMPscript blocks. So you might have noticed every time when I code within an AMPscript block or just earlier in the ampscript.io website, I like to have spacing, right? Decent spacing between my opening and ending tags within the AMPscript block. So I normally open the AMPscript block at the top here, create a space, have the closing, and then have my logic in the middle here, right? Just looks very nice, a lot easier to read. Don't do something like this. Even though the code will still work, this just looks so ugly and it hurts me every time I see another bit of code, whether I'm reviewing someone else's code or like reviewing a client's code. This hurts me deeply. So please don't code it like this. Create some spacing, make it look nice and neat. The other one is actually adding comments. So this is something I didn't show you just yet, but inserting comments in your code is actually very useful. It helps organizes the code, it documents your code, and allows easier interpretation for future references and handovers. So imagine if you handed this code to someone else, they can easily see, okay, logic to clean first name data. So whatever code is below this section helps me to identify the purpose, the functionality, and I can edit it in the future if I need to, right? It's easily identifiable. And you can always go back to it, make edits, change it, and you know what is happening in the code. Because at the moment, I've just been showing you some simple code, but in the screenshot I think you saw earlier, there could be a scenario where you code a bunch of functions in there. And if you have everything commented out, then you can see, okay, this is doing this, this is doing that. It helps the reader. And the syntax for a comment is very simple. It's just /*, write anything what you want in the comment, and then close it off with */. So that's the syntax there. And if you comment out the code, it just looks a lot nicer. Good for documentation. The final one here is the variables. So again, use camel case format. I think this is pretty straightforward. You don't have to, this is just best practice again, but if you have everything in camel case format, it's just easily identifiable. You can read it, you can comprehend it. And if you hand over to someone else, they can know what that variable is trying to do or what value it stores in that variable. If you have something like this, all fused within one word, it's very hard. It takes time for someone to just stop and think, okay, what is this variable? Okay, now it makes sense, right? It's just a lot quicker to read. Cool. Okay, so this is the end of the video, the summary. So there was a lot to cover in this video, so feel free to pause throughout to really get an understanding. Replay, watch certain sections again. But again, just to summarize overall, AMPscript code editor is very helpful. I recommend use it for sure when you're coding in Salesforce Marketing Cloud. It just helps you highlight the syntax. You can see what are functions, the variables, the strings, and so forth. The next video will dive deeper into functions. I know I gave you guys a preview of like proper case and what you can do with it. But the next video, I'll dive into more functions that you can play with and how you can use variables to your advantage. We also covered personalization strings. There's two types of personalization strings. There's attribute and system strings. So be mindful of the data quality when you're using attribute strings. This is something that I want to emphasize again and again because I've seen it so many times where clients or people just use the first name personalization string and realize afterwards when they sent the email out to thousands of people that the first name is incorrect. Inline AMPscript is another method. It's mainly used for single functions, as you saw, but again, it's very limited. The preferred method is always using AMPscript block. That's what I like to use. It's more for complex kind of data transformations, and you just have everything hosted at the top of the email template. So in the future, if you want to change anything, edit anything, just edit the top block, and then all the variables that you output in the email will reflect accordingly. A variable, so this is a new concept, especially for non-technical people. Think of it as a named container, like I explained before. It stores any value that you want inside of it, and you can reuse it throughout your code. So that's an advantage of using variables. In terms of assigning a value to a variable, you can retrieve data from ascending DE, and the best method again is using square brackets. And finally, best practice, like you saw on the slide before, use comments in your code. I think that's very handy. Not many people, sometimes I actually don't do it too often, but for like simple stuff, for anything complex that has a lot of code in it, best to use comments just to help help yourself when you reference it in the future to know where things are, what certain purpose or functionalities this bit of script does. And yeah, it's a good practice, good habit to get into. But cool, that's pretty much it, guys. Thank you so much. The next video will dive deep into functions. Again, if you like my content, feel free to follow me on YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok at VinCodes. I post, day in the life videos, office shenanigans, tips and tricks, some AMPscript Academy stuff as well. So feel free to follow me there. Again, if you haven't already, please post a testimonial on our testimonial page. It will mean a lot to me. So record a video or post an image, leave some comments, and you get to win a prize as well. Give me feedback so I can help improve. And that's pretty much it. Let's grow the community. If you know anyone that are interested in this community, please share it with them. And yeah, let's see how far we can take it. And yeah, see you in the next video.